The sight of the Boeing B-29 Superfortress was not merely the arrival of a new weapon, but the sudden manifestation of a crushing, insurmountable reality. The German civilian, accustomed to the familiar shapes of British Lancasters and American B-17s, suddenly saw something profoundly different in the high-altitude sky. It was a machine of a scale previously unimagined in the European theater, a sleek, silver leviathan that seemed to mock the efforts of their already depleted defenses. The sheer technological jump was visible even from the ground, as the massive wingspan and elongated fuselage defined an airborne presence unlike any other bomber they had yet encountered. Citizens often described the B-29 as an almost ethereal vision, a high-flying ghost passing through the stratosphere, untouchable by the anti-aircraft guns below. They spoke of its polished aluminum skin catching the sunlight, transforming the bomber into a distant, terrifying jewel against the endless blue. This single machine immediately shattered the lingering myth of German technological superiority that had been so carefully cultivated by the Nazi regime's propaganda machine. The Superfortress was a clear message delivered in aluminum and high explosives. America possessed an industrial capacity that simply dwarfed that of the Axis powers. Witnessing the B-29 flying effortlessly above the effective range of their best flak was a moment of stark, collective psychological trauma for those on the ground. It signaled a war that could now be fought, and lost, without the enemy ever having to descend into the chaos of the defensive barrage. The common reaction moved quickly from initial shock and bewildered curiosity to a deeper, more chilling recognition of the inevitable end. For the first time, many understood the true meaning of total war, a conflict where even the sky offered no sanctuary from the distant, silent approach of their destruction. A young woman in Hamburg reportedly whispered that the bomber looked like a visitor from another time, a chilling prediction of their future under relentless air power. The immense scale also translated into an implied, and terrifying, payload capacity, which directly multiplied the citizens' growing fear of mass devastation. This single observation of a new aircraft design encapsulated the final, brutal realization that their nation's fate was now entirely sealed by forces beyond their control. The B-29 became an instant, terrifying symbol of Allied industrial might and the sheer, unstoppable momentum of the war's final phase. The initial civilian reaction was often a mixture of hushed awe and a deep-seated, paralyzing fear that spread through the crowds. There were many whispers in the streets and bomb shelters, hushed conversations trying to make sense of the new, enormous shape in the sky. Older citizens recalled the Zeppelin raids of the Great War, but even those seemed a clumsy, primitive threat compared to this sleek, modern war machine. A common initial description was that the B-29 was not merely large, but seemed to possess a disproportionate, unnatural hugeness, a true giant among the smaller bombers. Children, often less versed in the technicalities of war, simply called it the Silver Monster or Sky Whale, giving voice to its terrifying scale. The whispers often revolved around technical speculation, a desperate attempt to categorize and thus neutralize the fear of the unknown. People debated its country of origin, the type of fuel it must consume, and, most urgently, the sheer number of bombs it must be capable of carrying. One account from a Berlin factory worker recounted how they tried to deny its existence, insisting it must be some trick of the light or a misidentified German prototype. The psychological impact was amplified by the lack of defensive fire reaching the aircraft, a silent testament to its unassailable operating altitude. The rumors that followed its first sightings were always exaggerated, adding a mythical quality to its destructive capabilities that outstripped even the horrific reality. Civilians would exchange stories of its speed and altitude, each telling building upon the last until the Superfortress became a legend of terrifying invincibility. The very name, B-29, was soon passed around in worried tones, an immediate shorthand for a new, insurmountable level of Allied dominance. The knowledge that the American military could produce such a complex and massive machine while Germany struggled to maintain basic production was a heavy blow to morale. Conversations often ended in a shared, troubled silence, the unspoken understanding that this was a war they could not possibly win against such overwhelming opposition. The aircraft's presence acted as a visible, daily counterpoint to the increasingly frantic and unbelievable victories claimed by the Reich Ministry of Propaganda. Every new sighting reinforced the profound sense of isolation and vulnerability felt by ordinary German families trapped beneath the unanswering sky. The appearance of the B-29 also introduced a new, chilling geopolitical reality into the German consciousness, linking the war's theaters in a tangible way. Many Germans initially assumed the giant bomber must be a further evolution of the familiar British or American heavy bomber fleets operating from Western bases. The sudden realization that this aircraft was primarily designed and deployed for the vast distances of the Pacific War added a deeper layer of dread to their fear. It suggested an enemy so overwhelmingly powerful that it could deploy its most advanced, custom-built strategic weapon to a secondary theater without hesitation. This implied that the sheer industrial depth of the United States was capable of fighting two massive, simultaneous wars with equipment designed for opposite sides of the globe. The German public's understanding of the B-29 as a Pacific bomber underscored their rapidly diminishing importance on the global stage. It was a sign that the Allies viewed Germany not as the primary, existential threat, but as a problem that could be handled with resources diverted from elsewhere. One memoir from a citizen of Dresden reflected on the shame and terror of realizing that they were being bombed by an aircraft that was, in essence, a luxury of the American war machine. The presence of the Superfortress flying over Central Europe was a symbol of resource allocation, an abundance of power that Germany could never hope to match. For soldiers and civilians alike, the B-29 represented a kind of overwhelming global reach that crushed the Nazi fantasy of a self-sufficient European fortress. The technological sophistication required for a long-range strategic bomber like the B-29 highlighted the immense failure of German high command to anticipate this scale of challenge. The people saw not just a bomber, but the shadow of a global superpower that could strike anywhere, at any time, with impunity. This shift from facing familiar European enemies to confronting a global industrial giant drastically escalated the sense of hopelessness among the population. The sheer audacity of deploying a Pacific theater weapon over Germany was a powerful statement of Allied strategic confidence and a psychological masterstroke. The fear was no longer just about the bombs, but about the inexhaustible capacity behind the bombs, the limitless resources that this new aircraft represented. The sound of the B-29's engines was a distinct and terrifying element of its arrival, a sound that immediately differentiated it from every other plane in the sky. German civilians had become tragically familiar with the low, throbbing roar of the four-engine piston bombers of the RAF and USAF. The Superfortress, however, possessed a higher, more powerful, and almost unnervingly steady sound, a deep hum that suggested immense, sustained power. The Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclone engines, with their unique, high-pitched whine and rhythmic roar, were an acoustic signature of impending disaster. People often described the sound as a constant, grinding thrum, a mechanical beat that resonated less with speed and more with heavy, unstoppable momentum. In the dead of night, the B-29's approach could be heard long before it became visible, building a slow, agonizing dread in the hearts of those below. This unfamiliar sound was instantly recognized as belonging to a new class of adversary, a noise that bypassed the mind and went straight to the primal fear center. The subtle acoustic difference was enough to trigger a panic, signaling that the standard operating procedures and air raid warnings might not apply to this new threat. For many, the noise was the audible proof of the bomber's impossible altitude, a sound so faint and yet so powerfully deep that it suggested a machine flying far above the clouds. The high-altitude operation meant the sound often seemed to come from nowhere, a terrifying resonance that filled the entire sky without a visible source. This unsettling disconnect between the powerful sound and the absent visible target further fueled the feeling of helplessness and fighting an unseen enemy. A Munich citizen recalled that the drone was the sound of the war leaving us behind, a mechanical declaration that German air defenses were obsolete. The deep rumble of the massive radial engines carried a sonic message of unparalleled mechanical reliability and the sustained power required for truly strategic flight. This auditory difference contributed immensely to the psychological warfare, turning the very atmosphere into an instrument of German terror. The relentless, droning hum of the Superfortress became the soundtrack to the war's final, most devastating period for those caught on the ground. The first sightings of B-29 debris or captured components, though rare, sent profound ripples of technological shock through German engineering circles and the civilian public. The Superfortress was a marvel of aeronautical design, incorporating features like a fully pressurized cabin and remote-controlled gun turrets that were radically advanced. German mechanics and engineers who saw even small fragments of the aircraft were reportedly stunned by the quality of the construction and the advanced metallurgy. They noted the precision of the skin panels and the innovative use of alloys that suggested manufacturing techniques superior to their own wartime standards. The pressurized fuselage was a feature that immediately made clear the Allied commitment to high-altitude precision bombing, a capability Germany could not fully match. The remote-controlled firing system for the gun turrets was a particularly shocking feature, representing a level of complexity and integration Germany had only dreamed of for its own aircraft. Civilians who heard the reports from the factories and Air Ministry could not escape the implication that their national technology was now trailing far behind the enemy's. One captured B-29 was studied intently, becoming an object of grim fascination for those few who were allowed to see the physical proof of Allied superiority. The clean, aerodynamic lines of the design contrasted sharply with some of Germany's own hastily designed and increasingly experimental late-war aircraft. The plane's technological elegance stood as a silent rebuke to the claims of superior Aryan engineering, a painful sight for any patriotic German citizen. The realization that the enemy possessed a bomber that required such advanced systems and materials struck at the heart of the propaganda myth of a technologically invincible Reich. Reports trickling down to the public suggested that the bomber was not just a weapon but a flying factory, too complex and massive for their own industry to replicate or effectively combat. The B-29 thus represented the terrifying, tangible endpoint of a vast and successful research and development pipeline that Germany had failed to maintain. The German response was a frantic, last-minute push for jet and rocket technology, a desperate attempt to leapfrog this overwhelming technological gap. The B-29 introduced a new operational paradigm that entirely redefined the nature of the air war for the German home front. Unlike earlier Allied raids that relied on large numbers and focused on overwhelming targets, the Superfortress represented the ultimate threat of high-value, precise attacks. Its altitude and speed meant that the German defensive system, which was built on the capabilities of its fighter interceptors and its flak network, was fundamentally bypassed. German fighter pilots, already spread thin and facing superior numbers, suddenly confronted an enemy that they could barely reach, let alone effectively engage. This helplessness was quickly absorbed by the civilian population, who realized that the defense system they had trusted for years was now functionally obsolete. The psychological devastation came from the realization that no matter how loud the air raid siren wailed, the enemy was untouchable and could strike without a meaningful defense. A man in a Bavarian village recounted seeing a single B-29 track across the sky without a single flak burst near it, a silence more deafening than any explosion. This new threat was characterized by its detachment, a cold, almost surgical approach to destruction from an altitude where the human element seemed absent. The B-29 was not merely a bomber, it was the flying symbol of an entirely new strategic doctrine, unanswerable, high-altitude mass destruction. Its design was the physical embodiment of the Allied shift toward debilitating the enemy's industrial and moral capacity from an untouchable distance. The appearance of this bomber effectively eliminated the final, small comfort of German citizens, which was the visible fight between the interceptors and the bombers. Now there was only a passive wait for the bombs, a silent acceptance of the war's inevitable, relentless escalation beyond their capability to withstand. This new air threat fundamentally changed the nature of survival, turning the experience of an air raid from a period of danger to a moment of resigned powerlessness. The fear it generated was a slow, persistent dread, the knowledge that the ultimate, unchallengeable enemy had finally arrived in the European theater of operations. One of the most immediate and demoralizing observations by German civilians was the B-29's ability to fly serenely above the ceiling of most ground-based defenses. The sight of the powerful anti-aircraft guns firing futilely, their shells bursting far below the passing bomber, became a tragically common and disheartening spectacle. The air raid warden in a small town might shout orders, but the citizens could see the physical, absolute limit of their defense technology displayed against the vastness of the sky. The aircraft's operational altitude of over 30,000 feet made it virtually immune to all but the very latest and highest caliber German flak guns. For the ordinary German soldier manning a standard 88mm gun, the B-29 represented a technical humiliation, an enemy they were equipped only to observe and not to engage. This technical superiority created a powerful psychological gap, where the distance between the bomber and the ground troops was measured not just in feet but in fate. The inability of the defense to even scratch the paint on the Superfortress was a profound and daily reminder of their technological inferiority. Civilians who witnessed this spectacle often expressed a feeling of being exposed, naked before an enemy who had discovered a dimension of the sky that was beyond their reach. The trails of condensation left by the B-29 in the upper atmosphere were often the only visible proof of its passage, a thin, white line marking its untouchable trajectory. These contrails became an iconic, haunting image of the war's final phase, an emblem of the effortless superiority of the Allied air campaign. The fact that the crew inside the pressurized cabin were essentially insulated from the chaos below further amplified the feeling of cold, industrial detachment. The German public correctly inferred that the development of such an aircraft meant the Allies had anticipated and prepared for every conceivable ground defense. This effective neutralization of their flak defenses was a crucial turning point in German morale, destroying the last vestiges of belief in a successful defense of the homeland. The B-29 had essentially declared a large part of the sky a safe zone for the enemy, and this fact was immediately understood by those watching from the shelters. The arrival of the B-29 created an immediate and devastating crisis for the tightly controlled Nazi propaganda machine. For years, Dr. Goebbels had maintained a narrative of German technological genius and the ultimate invincibility of the European Reich. The sight of a technologically superior, massive American bomber flying with impunity directly contradicted every article, radio broadcast, and rally speech. Civilians, who had been promised a secret weapon, or Wunderwaffe, that would turn the tide, now saw the enemy's own Wunderwaffe dominating their skies. The propaganda had painted the Allied air raids as minor nuisances that were being swiftly and effectively dealt with by the valiant Luftwaffe and ground crews. The Superfortress was a visual, undeniable refutation of this lie, a physical fact that no amount of rhetorical spin could obscure or explain away. People often noted the stark, painful contrast between the boastful newspaper headlines and the terrifying, silent reality of the distant silver aircraft. The B-29 became a silent judge of the regime's credibility, and its judgment was one of total and catastrophic failure to deliver on promises of security. The whispers in the bombed-out cities suddenly shifted from fear of the enemy to open, bitter skepticism toward their own government's reports. The aircraft essentially served as an airborne truth serum, forcing the public to confront the true imbalance of power between the belligerent nations. It was reported that some citizens began to collect leaflets dropped by the Allied planes, trusting the enemy's assessment of the war's status more than their own press. The constant, visible presence of the B-29 stripped away the comforting illusions and made the inevitable outcome of the war painfully clear to all observers. The propaganda machine's inability to effectively counter the psychological blow of the Superfortress was one of its most profound and final failures. The people realized that if the regime could not even protect the skies above their own homes, all other promises of victory were nothing more than empty, desperate words. The initial shock of the B-29's arrival quickly settled into a profound sense of resignation and the loss of the civilians' last, fragile hope for survival. The hope of being protected by the formidable German air defense system was the emotional pillar that had sustained many families through years of bombing. The sight of this new, unassailable bomber systemically dismantled that final psychological defense, leaving the civilians emotionally and physically exposed. The B-29 represented the ultimate symbol of the total saturation bombing that could now be carried out with zero risk to the attacking force. For the mothers huddling with their children in the damp, crowded air raid bunkers, the Superfortress was the sound of the future collapsing on top of them. Their conversations became less about surviving the current raid and more about the existential question of whether there would be a home to return to the next day. One reported quote from a civil defense worker stated simply, "The big one is here now," implying an end to the incremental threat and the start of a final, crushing blow. The bomber's vastness and altitude stripped away any notion of personal luck or individual heroism in survival, reducing the experience to a matter of random chance. The fear of the B-29 was not a momentary panic but a chronic, low-level anxiety that permeated daily life, coloring every decision and conversation. This loss of hope was not a sudden surrender but a gradual, soul-crushing realization that every aspect of the Allies' war effort was now superior to their own. The Superfortress thus became inextricably linked with the coming defeat, an engine of fate that was flying in according to a predetermined, unstoppable schedule. Its presence in the German sky was a daily, visceral reminder that the enemy was not tired, not spent, and possessed an inexhaustible determination to see the war through to its bitter conclusion. The civilian population understood that this was no longer a war of attrition they might win, but a countdown to total and complete military collapse. The Superfortress was often described as an unstoppable silver or a gleam of pure, indifferent destruction by those who witnessed its flight paths. The uniformity and discipline of the B-29 formations, when they flew in groups, spoke volumes about the Allied mastery of both air tactics and production. There was a stark, cold beauty to the aircraft's polished metal and clean design that made its destructive purpose all the more terrifying to the German eye. Unlike the often patched-up and battle-scarred German planes, the B-29s appeared pristine and freshly minted, suggesting an endless supply line waiting back in America. The very color, the metallic gleam of the massive airframes, was associated with an advanced, overwhelming industrial output that made Germany's own factories look antiquated. Citizens often spoke of the aircraft's effortless speed, noting how quickly it traversed the sky, leaving behind a profound feeling of being left behind by time and technology. This visual and mechanical perfection contributed to the psychological myth of its invincibility, a machine that seemed too flawless to be grounded by mere human effort. The B-29 was the flying manifestation of the massive economic disparity between the warring powers, a physical testament to the wealth of the arsenal of democracy. Its presence confirmed the German people's greatest fear, that they were fighting a war not against an army, but against an entire industrial continent. The sight was a constant visual metaphor for the inevitable, grinding, an overwhelming power that was slowly but surely crushing the Reich from above. The silver aspect of the aircraft became a symbol of the hard, cold, unfeeling nature of the Allied strategic bombing campaign. The fact that the aircraft could fly at such high altitudes meant that even the simple act of seeing it was an act of terror, a sighting of the inevitable, silent doom. The Superfortress was a daily, visible lesson in the hopelessness of their situation, a perfect machine executing a perfect, brutal task. In the wreckage of German cities, conversations about the B-29 took on a particularly somber and fatalistic tone among the survivors. Standing amidst the rubble of their homes, the citizens discussed the aircraft not as a military target, but as a meteorological event, a force of nature that simply could not be stopped. The Superfortress became a fixed point of reference in their discussions, a demarcation line between the period of manageable raids and the current, unendurable stage of the war. The consensus in these conversations was often one of grim acceptance, a general understanding that the war's end was now a matter of when, not if. Elderly men who had once been staunch party members were reported to be openly expressing doubts about the leadership's ability to protect the homeland from such a threat. The topic of the B-29 was discussed in whispers, sometimes with a dark, bitter humor, calling it Hitler's last surprise or the American flying fortress of lies. The aircraft's arrival spurred a painful re-evaluation of the entire course of the war, as people began to question the long-term viability of their leaders' aggressive strategies. The scale of the bomber was so impressive that it sometimes led to grudging admiration, a recognition of the enemy's capacity that transcended national animosity. A school teacher in a shelter was overheard explaining to children that the bomber was proof of the size of the world and the magnitude of their foe, a stark lesson in global reality. These ruined city conversations were the true barometer of German morale, a private, unvarnished expression of their deep-seated and growing despair. The sheer mass and power of the B-29 made all of the previous hardships seem like mere precursors to the final, devastating act of the strategic bombing campaign. The bomber's image was seared into the collective memory as the machine that finally broke the German spirit, the undeniable proof of Allied victory. The ultimate statement made by the first B-29 sighting was the psychological declaration of the war's inevitable and swiftly approaching end. For the German civilian, the Superfortress was the final, unmistakable sign that all resistance had become futile against the colossal power of the combined Allied forces. It was not merely an aircraft but a harbinger, a sleek, silver messenger of defeat delivered high above the clouds and beyond the reach of their defenses. The immense resources and advanced technology it represented confirmed the terrifying imbalance of industrial might that could never be overcome. The constant, unpunished presence of the Superfortress in the sky eroded the last vestiges of belief in a German victory or a negotiated peace. Conversations began to shift from hopes of victory to quiet, practical plans for survival and the daunting prospect of life under Allied occupation. The B-29 effectively turned the air war into a one-sided execution, where the only variable was the time and place of the next inevitable strike. The sight of it flying high above the turmoil below was a daily, cold reminder that the enemy was perfectly capable of destroying Germany at leisure. The very design of the plane, built for endurance and high-altitude flight, suggested a long, sustained campaign that would not stop until the final collapse. This final, powerful symbol of technological and industrial superiority was the last nail in the coffin of the German public's will to continue the fight. The B-29's debut in the European theater was a profound, non-verbal communication of the Allied commitment to unconditional surrender. The quiet, terrified observations of this new bomber marked the point where collective German anxiety gave way to a painful, final, and absolute recognition of defeat. The legacy of the B-29 in the European sky was the creation of a profound psychological landscape of finality, accelerating the end of the war for those on the ground.